Okay, I have a story time for you guys tonight, and it's called The Story of Cell. So, Cell was created by a man named Dr. Gero. You know, Goku had ran through and, took care of those guys, right? The Red Ribbon Army. He did that shit by himself as the boy, right? We know about Goku and his feats as a kid, right? Um, True Dragon Ball Z fans know about that shit, and he did that. But Dr. Gero wanted to get revenge on Goku, right? So he created a organism, artificial being, an android, the perfect creature to defeat Goku. But it take years for this creature to like fully realize itself. Um, so it was inside of a secret lab. So and he's like this little thing, like this. He's like a zygote or whatever. Um, but they have the little fucking Red Ribbon Army insects flying around for like the past I don't know how long. It was a long time because they caught data on Goku's fight with Vegeta. They caught data on Gohan and all the Z fighters. You know during their time fighting Vegeta when they came down, right? They even caught records and footage of Trunks, future Trunks coming back in time and killing Frieza. Caught Frieza on camera. All of this was data that went into Cell. Cell used that data and basically he could use any of the moves that these flies caught window. You know, through videotape, video recording. And he was able to get the um, DNA and apply it to his cells. Right now, this is where shit's kind of it ain't crazy, but it is. The androids were awakened. They were awoken, right? Android 17, 18, and 16. But Cell comes about later on after they're already awake. He came back in time from Trunks' timeline. Not the future Trunks that they see in the current timeline of Dragon Ball during the Cell Saga, but another, Trunks who already went back in time and defeated the androids, and he was going back to like let them know it was cool. But then Cell, snuck up behind him and killed his ass. Reverted back to his larvae state and went back in time to where Android 17 did exist, so he could become perfect. He needed 17 and 18 to become the perfect life form. A truly perfect creature that could destroy Goku and realize his purpose. Um, so he did that, right? He went back in time, um, and then he came out, right? He reverted back to his what we call his first form, right? Um, he or not reverted. He grew into his first form. He took on his first form and he like wiped out a whole city. He took them for their biofuel. That's energy for him. He was able to um, fight against Piccolo, who was actually strong enough to kill him. Actually, he was a super Namekian. He had actually fused with Kami and became fully realized as that nigga. So, and it basically was shown and stuff too. You know it because he was not sweating that fight. Now, what it was Cell had got the jump on him because this is Cell, right? Cell was, he started pulling out Kamehameha. He didn't know that this, creature could pull off Kamehameha techniques. That's Goku's move, you know. He didn't know that that was, in his bag. He used a little move called, Solar Flare to get the fuck away. Then he started, absorbing city after city, city after city. They were trying to like stop him beforehand, but They were trying to, wait for Goku to get out of the hyperbolic time chamber so they could kill the androids, and then kill Cell. But Cell ended up, absorbing a whole lot of people. Android 17 and 18, or 17 and 18 pulled up to Kame House. They did that shit with, Piccolo. Piccolo was fighting at 17, but then Cell showed up. Cell was like, oh, guess what? Um, I'm strong enough now to, take Android 17 for myself. He dismissed the tired Piccolo. Um, and then he absorbed 17. He was now a semi-perfect being. All he needed was Android 18, and then the transformation was complete. He was halted by Tien Shinhan for a little bit. Then Vegeta came out of the hyperbolic time chamber. He was a super Vegeta. And he was, putting belt ass on him, but his Saiyan pride got in the way. He's like, I want to fight you at your, strongest, so you ain't bitching in hell about when I put you there, right? I'll put you there at your best, not at your worst. You know. So then Cell went and he absorbed Android 18 because, Krillin and, other people couldn't stop Cell. Um, he absorbed Android 18 and then he became perfect Cell, right? He is in his perfect form. He killed Krillin almost. He kicked him. Almost killed him. Then he proceeded to fight against Vegeta. He dismissed Vegeta. He defeated him. I know. But that's what happened, right? Then Trunks fought against Cell. Cell was like, "Yeah, I could kill you right now, but man, I'll wait. We'll make it interesting." He's like, "Stay tuned for like updates and shit." He went on broadcast, live television, worldwide, and he said, "This is the Cell Games, and I'm hosting them. Right? It's everybody versus me, and if you can't, defeat me, the world's defeat, or the world's destroyed, right? But if you can, you save the world. It's me versus all of Earth's best fighters, and I know who these fighters are, so they can pull up, when they need to." And he gave him 10 days to train and get ready for it, be cool. But he was also fucking around, like still killing people. And Goku had to pull him, like, "Hey man, why the fuck are you like, killing people and all this stuff?" He's like, "Well, they attacked me." He's like, "You'll have to wait for that day." And he's like, "Okay," and Goku fought on that day against Cell, and Cell was, actually winning that fight. Goku didn't have enough like training or any of that shit to beat Cell. He knew it even before going into it. People like the Blaze Goku and shit. Nah, he wasn't winning that fight. He even like conceded the match, and he was doing the best he could against Cell. But, he had to give that shit up to his son because he knew his son had, some extra, he was just, holding back. Now Cell was like, "You put a child in front of me, that's disrespectful. I'll kill this kid, and then, hey man, you kind of foolish for giving me a sense of me." He ended up, fighting against Gohan. But then he's like playing games with Gohan. He's like, "I want to see you, actually fight. Your father seems to think you're some kind of badass." So then he's like, "Guess what? I'll, have these little Cell Juniors fight against your friends. They might kill your friends, but I don't care. I'll make you angry." Android 16 pulled up behind Cell and tried to, cook him alive. And Cell was like, "No." And he, he ended up killing Android 16 in front of Gohan. That sparked, Super Saiyan 2. The first Super Saiyan 2 born was Gohan, right? Um, then Gohan was putting belt to us, and Cell. Cell was like, "Oh my God, hell no." He ended up puking up Android 18, and then he, went into self-destruct mode because he still wanted to win. I still win, but then Goku, being a hero, he ended up taking, Cell to, Otherworld, and then blowing up King Kai's planet. Cell's gray matter still, existed in, you know, the atmosphere of space or whatever, or not the atmosphere of space, but in the, void space or whatever, right? Outer space. So he was able to regenerate, recoup from that, this little piece of, gray matter that was like that. And he shot himself back to Earth, using instant transmission. And he was like super perfect cell by that point. You know, he was stronger than he was before, Gohan, had to protect Vegeta, and then they were in that power struggle. Cell actually had the upper hand for a little bit, but Gohan was holding back. You know, once he, wasn't holding back no more, it was the end of Cell. Cell got, packed up. There's no other way to, say that shit, man. He got, he got fucking cooked. He got sent to hell. Um, but Cell was a decent, villain. And he had them on the fucking ropes. But like, they could have beat Cell at any point in time, like before that. Like, in his first form, they could have beat him. They could have beat him in his second form. But the way the story developed, it wouldn't have been a story if, they did that. That's why, Cell became the way he was. Because Piccolo could have beat him. Trunks and Vegeta could have beat him, right? But that didn't happen. That's the story of Dragon Ball Z for you, and that's the story of Cell. Some of you like him, and he's decent as a villain. He helped Gohan get his flowers, I guess. But be cool, go on the corner, and let me know what you know about that.